Welcome everybody, sorry we're slightly late. Welcome to the small but select audience here in the room and to the rather larger one out there. Welcome to the Theatre of Westminster, where a former London mayor may be on the way out, but we welcome a serving mayor, Jamie Driscoll, Mayor of North Tyne Combined Authority. This is the 7th in our series of talks on levelling up, and we're very pleased to have an actual serving mayor. We've had talks from Andy Haldane, Paul Ormerod, Raggy Bally, and others. Yeah, this is definitely our first talk from a serving mayor. And Jamie is going to look at the politics of levelling up, how to align interests across often rather complicated different levels of government, and of course across political traditions. Jamie, despite being Mayor of Newcastle and Points North, is actually from Middlesbrough originally, left school at 16, was a mature student, studied engineering at Northumbria University in Newcastle, ended up running a software company, and then in 2019 defeated Nick Forbes, who was then leader of Newcastle Council and became the first mayor of North Tyne Combined Authority. Other interesting biographical details: he has a black belt in jiu-jitsu, if I pronounce that correctly, and he has also homeschooled 2 of his boys, which I think is quite an unusual thing for a politician to do. In some ways, levelling up is one of the few areas of public policy where there is a fair amount of cross-party consensus. The levelling up white paper, when it came out in February, was greeted pretty positively across a pretty broad spectrum of opinion. I think it is also fair to say that it has gone a bit quiet since then. I mean, levelling up is obviously a very long-term project that Jamie, I'm sure, will talk us through. And actually, I was kind of listening to all the noise today, you know, the few defenders of Boris Johnson who are still on the airwaves listing the things that they saw as his achievements, were not talking about levelling up. However, I think almost whatever happens post-Boris Johnson, assuming we are in a post-Boris Johnson world, I think the focus on levelling up is going to return. It's going to have to return for this government, I think, before the next election, because they will be judged, even though a lot of the goals are being realised in 2030. Nonetheless, Labour will be chasing them up on all those targets. So it's very good to have Jamie here to give us the perspective from the northeast, the poorest region in England, and a view from the north and from the left. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you for welcoming me to SW1, so close to Whitehall, Westminster, and number 10. I appreciate there is a perhaps more entertaining political event playing out around the streets around here at the moment. And to some extent, I think that's the problem, and that's what levelling up needs to address, is government by pantomime, or politics by pantomime, and the who's up, the who's down, the who's going in to see the Prime Minister. I wrote this talk at the weekend, and I mentioned instability, and today has proved me spectacularly right. We're in the middle of negotiating a devolution deal for the North East. I've been politically working on this for 3 years. Negotiations in earnest with ministers for 6 months. A minister many of you will know well, Neil O'Brien, who I very much like working with. Of course, today has resigned, which is entirely his decision. I don't quite understand those reasons. Who now signs off these decisions? There are government departments that literally have no one in them. And where are the alternative centres of government that keep England in particular running during this period? Who knows how this is going to play out? I think we all have our own intuitions. But let's start with an analogy. I'll tell you a little story. There's a bloke taking a walk near a golf course, and he sees two golfers. The first one with his blue check trousers on, puts the ball on the tee, settles his stance, swings his 4-iron, thwack. He looks, and then he sighs as the ball bounces on the green but doesn't go in the cup. And then his golfing partner in the red check trousers says, look, you're doing it all wrong. It needs more welly and a 5-iron. So he puts his ball on the tee, checks the wind, swings, looks as the ball shoots down the fairway, and then he sighs when the ball doesn't go in the cup. And he blames the other guy for leaving the green so cluttered. And the passerby is watching these two, and they do it time and time again. Every time criticising the other's technique, trying different clubs, different swings, but every time the ball doesn't go in the cup. And the passerby says, can I ask what you're doing? And one of the golfers says, the first one to get the ball in the cup wins. Can I have a go? Yeah, knock yourself out. So he walks over to the golf bag, pulls out a putter, strides down the fairway, taps in one of the balls from 3 feet, and the others look at each other and say, why didn't we think of that? And you cannot level up the Northeast from SW1. There's been, over the past 40 years, 52 innovations in local government. Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs guy, he said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So over the past 40 years, successive governments have tried 52 different policy interventions to close the gap on regional wealth inequality. And yet the inequalities get wider. RDAs, LEPs, city deals. Because it doesn't matter whether you're using a putter, a driver, or a cricket bat if you're using the wrong paradigm. It's a simple matter of pragmatism. It's hard to accomplish any task if you are not on the scene. In Newcastle city centre, there's a huge statue of Charles Earl Grey, the guy who the tea's named after. And when he was Prime Minister nearly 200 years ago, the British government was all about empire building. It was basically centralised in London. And its primary purpose was to stop power falling into the hands of distant, unruly tribes. And that's kind of how it feels today. So, while it might be obvious to an outsider that you can, in fact, play the ball from the green, for those in SW1, they've spent their entire career in a culture where you only ever play the ball from the tee. 200 years of conditioning kicks in, and confirmation bias takes over. So every time an RDA or a LEP or a city deal, whatever comes along, the ultimate power, the purse strings, remain in SW1. So what's the problem we're trying to fix? I was talking to Michael Marmot recently, and let's have a look at some of these slides. So this one, you can see healthy life expectancy. This is the age at which you can function without then having severely limited mobility or health impinging on your life. Around about 64, the average for England, which obviously includes the Northeast, that average. If you look at what's happened in Newcastle, it's gone from 60 in around about 2010 down to 56 now. People are getting worse. It's not that it's levelling up, it's levelling down. If we look at how policy interventions have affected, this is a mixture of benefit and taxation. So for pensioners, broadly even, not much change whether you're in the poorest decile or the richest decile. But if we have a look at that red line, everybody who's working age with children is slightly worse off, but particularly if you are poorer. And even if you don't have kids, it's the poorest decile that's suffering most. If we have a look at the spending on it, so levelling up fund allocations, £32 per person in the north in 2021, and the average drop in council spending per year, this is not over the 10-year period, £413 per person in the north. And just the last one, I'll not go through a lot of these, but food insecurity. There's lots of information on that slide. But what it tells you is that we have huge numbers of people who haven't eaten for a full day, who are skipping meals, and this is really what levelling up's about. Now, the life course summary. So on this slide, there's a little key there. If the writing is in red, it's worse than the rest of England. If the writing is in green, it's better than the rest of England. And male life expectancy at birth is lower. Female life expectancy at birth is lower. Mothers smoking at the time of delivery is worse. Infant deaths per 1,000 is actually better in the North East. We have the best hospitals in the country and the worst health in the country, which tells you that it's the social determinants of health that are really acting here. And you can go all the way through that slide. I'll leave it up there while I talk for a little while. But the specific interventions that need to happen, lots of people have tried. There's arguments about public finance, there's arguments about austerity. But even before that, pre the financial crash in particular, there was still a widening wealth inequality. And some might argue that these inequalities are best left to sort themselves out. If you're a libertarian economist, a free market fundamentalist, you might dismiss the entire concept of levelling up. But this is not about free market versus state intervention. Both are going to happen anyway. In any real world version of this, there will be state intervention. There will be state-funded school-age education. There'll be state-funded roads. The question is, who will decide which roads get built or how schools will interact with local businesses when it comes to careers advice? And where these decisions will be taken. Will they be taken at the tee, or will we let people on the green take the putt? And what devolution gives us is iteration, the ability to run several similar but different models concurrently, where one mayoral combined authority can learn from the others. And the important part, how it worked out in practice. So it may be that I try something in Newcastle in the North East, it may be that Tracy tries something in Leeds in West Yorkshire, that Andy Streets tries something in Birmingham in the West Midlands, and they will all be subtly different, and you don't normally get this in government, that ability to run a real world experiment, because we spend a long time working up a policy and then implement it, and then there's a change of government and they change it anyway. So the iteration part of it is not to be underestimated. And everybody in every party talks about needing innovation in industry. The only thing that seems to be off limit to innovation is governance. So I want to develop three more themes. First, the political environment, the effects that our political structures and cultures have on getting things done. Second, I'll tell you a little bit about the North Tyne, run through some of the real world examples of what we've been able to do and what we've been unable to do and why. And third, I'll run through the policy prescriptions that we'll need if we're ever going to deal with the problem of huge numbers of our citizens being left behind. So, the political environment. Any event takes place in a real place and a real time. And there's a risk in the policy world of talking in the abstract. We are in a very unstable political environment, I wrote at the weekend. Our government is in partial paralysis from trying to mitigate the failings of one person in charge. It is literally the case, by the way, this evening that we don't have a government. There are whole departments that have no ministers. That's not a party political point, by the way, and it's not me telling the Prime Minister to resign. It's people in his own party. I was given a speech to a Labour Party conference a couple of months ago, and sitting around the dinner table talking to my boys and my wife, and I said, look, what shall I talk about? What should be the theme of it? And Nelson, he's my 14-year-old, he says, well, there's a total mess in the government. Nobody knows what's happening. He says there's a war in Ukraine that might even end up nuclear. There's crops failing around the world. There's a climate emergency coming. There's inflation out of control. I'm worried that I will ever be able to get a house. He says, I just want someone to tell me there's a way out. And when I talk about political instability, it's not just the top of the Tory party. It is a massively unstable world, unlike anything I can remember. And while I'm not some kind of historical determinist, the cause of much of this instability was not only foreseeable, but in many cases foreseen. So COVID was a wild card, certainly. Even those who'd warned about a pandemic couldn't have predicted how and when it would occur. But the climate emergency, well, we've known about that for a long time, and we've known about Brexit since June 2016. And the causes of Brexit, the anger and frustration, came precisely from left behind places that are the subject of levelling up. The austerity that made life harder for people started a decade ago. But even before that, before the financial crash, it was only redistributive spending that kept these places buoyant. They were not the wealth generating centres that they had been during a century or more of heavy industry. This crisis has been visibly growing for decades. I talk to a lot of fund managers and bankers and sovereign wealth funds, and they all tell me one thing. There are trillions, literally trillions, looking for a return that's reasonably safe and will yield a bit more than the 1%, 2% you get on government bonds. In fact, one fund manager used the phrase money sloshing around looking for a home. And instead of going into productive investment, it's being used for share buybacks. So why is government not creating investable propositions for all this undeployed capital if we have so many problems in need of solution? There's a short story called Poseidon. It's 465 words in the English translation. Poseidon is sitting at the bottom of the sea. He's administering his realm. He spends his time doing calculations and paperwork. He finds that there's so much administration, he never gets it finished. It's not that he doesn't have any assistants, he has lots of assistants, but he doesn't quite trust them enough to truly delegate because he feels he would have to check the work anyway. And the thing that upsets Poseidon the most is that people think he spends his time riding around the oceans with his trident, living a life of glory. The only time he sees his domain is when he's summoned to Olympus to see the boss of the gods, Zeus, from where he invariably returns in a rage. And Poseidon has a hope that at the end of the world, just before everything finishes, he won't have to worry about his paperwork and he'll be able to take a quick tour of his realm. Now that story is written by Franz Kafka and conveys both the essence and a salutary warning of what it is to be a politician in power. Karl von Clausewitz, the military theorist from the Napoleon era, friction, wrote Clausewitz, is a concept that differentiates actual war from war on paper. Those surprising things that happen during wartime that make even the simplest thing difficult. You might want to send cavalry to a position 10 miles away, which looks fine on the map, but then the men come to a stream and they find the bridge has been washed out and they have to take a long detour and they don't arrive in time for battle. Clausewitzian friction is the main barrier to levelling up from Whitehall. Trying to hit a hole in one from the tee invites friction. Putting from the green mitigates the opportunities for friction. And not only that, the relationships and structures are in place in a region to enable things to happen quickly. So Kickstart, remember Kickstart? Announced 2 years ago, July 2020. £2 billion policy to give 250,000 young people a 6-month work placement. Good idea. People across the ideological spectrum are in favour of the principle. The government pays 100% of the wages, plus £1,500 support and training. Press reports, parliamentary questions and evidence from local areas suggest take-up was very low. Why? Because DWP kept hold of the rules and changed the rules part-way through about who could be a gateway. Smaller employers could not sign up directly but had to use a middleman. Mayoral combined authorities like mine asked if we could have it devolved and use it flexibly. There were cohorts we knew who could benefit who didn't meet the specific criteria. No, they said it would be run by job centre coaches. We were allowed to be a gateway, but that was all. But they didn't have the links with the employers in the same way. They don't administer the skills budget, and so they don't have the links with the training providers in the same way. There was no specific mistake. There was no officer or civil servant who didn't do their job. They worked hard, they kept in touch with my team, albeit it sometimes took a while to get an answer from higher up. It was the model that failed. They insisted on playing the ball from the tee, and as a result, the friction caused the programme to miss its targets. What's been learned? I don't know. There's very little data, and DWP has said it's not planning to carry out a robust evaluation. So contrast that with the devolution of the adult education budget. This is about post-19 education, skills training it's sometimes colloquially called. Basic maths and English plus vocational training, you know, chefs, HGV drivers and so on. Immediately work-relevant skills. This was devolved to the North of Tyne on the 1st of August 2020. It's hard to imagine a worse time to have something devolved than in the middle of a pandemic. We didn't even know if the colleges were going to be open. How do you teach chefs online? I don't even know if that's possible. So my team worked with all the providers and looked at what was possible. And where they had an idea that would mitigate the problem, we said yes. I didn't even get involved at that level of detail. My team ran through the basic principles with me. I said, use your judgment, I'll stand responsible, which is the job of a politician. And just as would happen in any industrial operation, the team cracked on. The team worked with other mayoral combined authorities to see how they were approaching it, and we worked together. Now, if you recall, we were back into lockdown that autumn. Despite that, in the first year, for the same budget, we increased enrolments by 10%. Because when you're close, you can reduce the friction. I could tell you about the Community Renewal Fund, another worthy idea, give grants of £250,000 upwards to projects that pilot programmes and new approaches to invest in skills, community places, local businesses. And they made MCAs, mayoral combined authorities, responsible for collating the bids from their areas. How could I possibly object to that? Well, if they'd said, Jamie, we've divvied up the money, you can have your per capita share, there's £3.25 million, don't spend it all at once. I'd have been very happy, but that's not what happened. We had a deadline of getting bids in by June the 10th, I think it was last year. The money had to be spent by the end of the financial year, March this year. And a lot of these organisations are quite small. People have said to me, look, Jamie, I can't increase my turnover by 50% for 6 months and then have a cliff edge. Government said, they told us we would know which bids were successful by the end of July. In fact, it was October before we found out, because of an added level of friction was introduced, the political prioritising, what in the US they call pork barrel politics. And we'll see the same with the Shared Prosperity Fund. 60% of the budget that's allocated to that is in year 3. And there's no certainty that funding will continue beyond that. So this is the difference between fighting a war on paper and a war in reality. What makes sense when you're moving budget lines around on a spreadsheet in Whitehall translates into employment decisions in reality. Who's going to be able to recruit someone to run a project, a business scale up, a youth work scheme for 1 year? Because what you're actually saying to people is, can you come and work for me from April 24, but by April 25 I can't guarantee you're going to be able to pay your mortgage and you'll be looking for another job. And the workforce won't be developed and the schemes will underperform. And everybody knows this. And in fact, that's the reason they put these impossible deadlines out there. They're aware of the problem and they think, well, let's just put a tighter deadline on it. The Shared Prosperity Fund's plans have to be in government by 1st of August. We're told we'll have approval by October. How stable is government to make these decisions at the moment? I don't know. I've got an inkling. But how quickly do we think people can recruit their staff to deliver this work? They're certainly not going to recruit at risk, these organisations, when they don't know if they're going to have the funding. Yet the schemes in my mayoral combined authority run smoothly. Inward investment. First big firm, very sure, that we landed in the North of Tyne was about 5 months after I was elected. I met their directors. I asked them what they were really looking for. A loyal workforce, they said. They didn't want staff turnover. And I said, well, will you look after them? Tell me about your experience with the company. And they'd all started on the shop floor, they'd worked their way up, and they actually valued the fact that I was serious about them looking after their workers. And I've since shot videos for them, encouraging people to apply for jobs there. I've been on the telly saying this is a great company, go work there. And it's the way decisions are made in good private sector companies. It's agile. In February 2020, just before COVID really hit, Procter & Gamble got in touch with me. Their R&D director had read my manifesto, knew I wanted to support green industry, and approached me with a proposal for a research centre to develop sustainable chemicals, lower energy use in washing powders, lower environmental impact, bringing in local SMEs, the universities, and she said she could leave us some money in from their global corporation, from their global VP. Would I support it? And by the way, she said, her colleagues had told her not to bother speaking to me. Don't waste your time approaching government, they'd said. It takes years to get anything done. Despite lockdown, that project was operational by July and has since exceeded all its targets. And it's not just me. Other mayors can all tell similar stories. Now, I've never actually played golf, but well, not the one that didn't involve a little windmill. But my job means that I can put the ball in the hole, metaphorically. Friction also appears when it comes to working with government. If I want to influence a minister to get something done, the reality is it only happens if we've built a good relationship. And only then if it's in the gift of an individual minister or secretary of state. Sometimes that does happen. Some ministers understand that if anything good's going to happen, they need delivery partners. I'm not going to mention individual ministers, especially not at the moment, as some of them I don't think would, with a leadership contest in the offing, a tacit endorsement from a Labour mayor might not be that welcome. But it can take an age. You know, their PA is on leave. A key official has COVID. Their diary has to align with mine. Jupiter has to be in Saturn. It takes a lot of time, and it's not sustainable. I'm already on to my third local government minister, who has today resigned. I've only been mayor for 3 years, and of course in most cases what I want isn't even in the gift of a minister. Like Poseidon, every time they go to see Zeus, they come back frustrated because Treasury controls all the purse strings. I had a phone call with Michael Heseltine in summer 2019, not long after I was elected, and he'd written a report about empowering English cities. And we went through his recommendations. I said, yep, I agree with that. Yep, agree with that too, Michael. Yep. On it went. And I found myself chuckling. I said, Michael, I said, you were a high-profile minister in the Thatcher years. I never thought I'd find myself agreeing with you. And he chuckled back and he says, well, when it comes to clearing up a bomb site, it doesn't really matter which dead economist you believe in. So perhaps it's my private sector background, perhaps it's my engineering, maybe it's my years of teaching people to fight. But my overriding question with any plan or policy is pragmatic. Will it work? And not just in the short term, but is it sustainable? Any engineer can design a wonder product so long as there's a support team to keep fixing it. The real question is, will it still work when we stop spending a lot of effort and money on it? And that's where we need to get to with public policy. And this approach should be independent of left or right or free market versus state control. It requires recognising that there may be more than one solution to a problem, and that problem might not even be visible until you lift the bonnet and start work. And it requires accepting that no policy exists in a vacuum. To go back to the engineering analogy, if you intend a complete product redesign, you have to get everyone on board. Logistics, purchasing, production, marketing, finance. Change has a cost. If you can't make it better, leave it alone. Build in continuous improvement instead by letting people control their own processes. Hierarchies build in friction. Complexity is our enemy. And by the way, I lead a cross-party combined authority. Metro mayors are the only people who don't get to choose who's in their cabinet. It's automatically the leaders and deputies of the local authorities in my patch. But because we co-design our programmes with our local authorities, there has never been a vote against anything in our MCA. We just crack on. So when we're talking about aligning different political traditions, we've kind of cracked it. And there's no shadow mayor. So I don't have to defend myself against someone trying to make silly points scoring every week. The structure rewards joint working. We have productive incentives rather than perverse incentives. So that's the principles. But what specifically should we do? Well, first, define what we want to happen and let the mayor with the mandate decide how to go about it, even if as central government you don't like it. If you want someone to solve a complex problem, you can't micromanage them. You have to work with their motivations. And as a father with 2 teenage boys, I know this only too well. You cannot say, tidy your room, it just doesn't happen. So ask the mayors to set out their vision. For me, I don't believe in social mobility. And that's a pretty unusual statement coming from a Labour mayor. Social mobility, for me, is a doctrine of accepting failure. Before we've even started, it says there are bad places with poor health and poor housing and insecure work and endemic crime and little hope. But we'll engineer it so the lucky ones can escape. We shouldn't need social mobility. There should be no places where hope does not shine. And I don't believe in redistribution either, at least not as the end game. Redistribution accepts that some people will be much richer than others. That's a reality. But we'll tax them a bit to help the poor people. Redistribution builds in inequality and dependency. I want to get to a place where everyone can generate wealth and have agency over their own life. And that will most certainly mean rethinking how we value and reward much of the vital work that takes place in our society. And I want to transition to a green economy because, well, I've read the evidence and how extremely dangerous the climate emergency is. Now, all of this is compatible with the levelling up targets. And I know some of the targets have come under criticism from various think tanks about their specificity, how they're measured, are they too ambitious, others are lacking in ambition. That's a discussion for another day. But in broad terms, they want better health, better mental health, education, transport, more money in people's pockets, lower crime. Well, yeah, who doesn't want that? And for me, the core of that is jobs. If we can get everyone the chance of a secure job that pays their bills, with enough left over for a holiday and some savings, half of our other problems will evaporate. And all the evidence supports that. People with agency live longer, healthier, more productive lives. And that requires an economic model where there's a job for everyone who wants one and where the wages are high enough to live a life of contentment. And that includes sectors traditionally regarded as low paid, including social care and hospitality, distribution, retail workers. We must focus on improving the foundational economy just as much energy as on the high productivity sectors of digital and manufacturing. And this will include digital adoption in the foundational economy, providing more skills training and professionalisation, so the workforce becomes more valued and better paid, resulting in lower staff turnover and high productivity. And we're succeeding on both fronts in the North Tyne, but not at the pace that's needed to close the gap anytime soon. In our first year of adult education devolution, the number of people without qualifications has dropped from 7.1% to 6%. That's remarkable. But it's not easy. And there's a catch-22. If we're saying a high-skill, high-wage economy is a virtuous circle, we are logically also saying a low-waged, low-skill economy is a vicious circle. We need skills, housing, transport, better school-age education. We need the jobs. And yes, trade unions and collective bargaining and better employment legislation. The theory that investing in R&D now will create good jobs in future is a sound theory. But those kids who are going to school hungry today won't be getting those jobs. The lucky ones might through social mobility, but most of them won't. I'll give you an example. 0.4% of school kids in the North East are excluded from school. The rate is rising rapidly. There's a perverse incentive for academy trusts to exclude kids who are a handful. And I've got 2 school-age sons. I get that parents want their kids to have calm classrooms, I do. The alternative provision for kids who've been excluded is scattergun. I've heard stories about kids being driven around in taxis for 2.5 hours in Northumberland. Kids whose provision is known on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but no one knows where they are on a Thursday and Friday. And unless we fix this, 0.4% of kids excluded means 0.4% on the unemployment figures for a generation and a permanent increase in health and burden on the criminal justice system. So aside from the moral imperative, it will cost us a fortune. Keeping people in poverty is an incredibly expensive thing to do. The problems don't start at secondary school. When I talk to primary school teachers, they tell me there's a year-on-year increase in emotional and mental health problems with their kids. And these are problems that have been building in communities for years. Parents with mental ill health, alcoholism or drug use or domestic violence at home. A referral to child and adolescent mental health services, CAMS, takes about 2 years. And even the kids who do get an appointment are seen away from their school environment and not in the context of where they most need the support. And these teachers tell me that they want training for their teachers and teaching assistants to be able to identify and deal with these problems as soon as they see them. But fixing this encounters friction. The system is fragmented. Different school operators, DFE sets policy, Treasury sets funding. The cycle time is long and the friction is immovable. The same head teachers tell me, by the way, that they want better links with local companies so kids can set their horizons on good jobs. As you'd expect, many kids want to grow up to be footballers or pop stars, and good luck to them. But they also need to know what engineers and scientists and team leaders and technicians and graphic designers and welders are. A scheme like that needs regional coordination and a budget. Unless we replace the doctrine of social mobility with a doctrine of universal wealth generation, we will fail. We will fail the people who most need us. The children growing up in intense pockets of deprivation, in families struggling not just with poverty but with mental ill health and recidivism and basic numeracy and a fear of all state services. There is ironclad evidence that health, education, housing, transport, secure, well-paid work are all pieces of the same jigsaw, and improvements in one will cascade into improvements in the others. It's a circle, and we can leave it vicious or make it virtuous. And we can only achieve this all at once, like a barn raising. You have to put all the sides up at the same time. Now, I know how to create jobs with good pay. Government set up my MCA with a target of 10,000 jobs over 30 years. We've invested in offshore wind, we've invested in digital businesses, we're attracting big firms to set up UK headquarters in my patch, and we're boosting small businesses with supporting them with skills programs, working directly with SMEs. Last week I visited a firm who needed help to buy a derelict factory that stood empty for 10 years. There's 100 people working in it now. Skilled work, making modular clean rooms that get exported around the world, and these people are on high wages. To count our job figures, to count on it, it has to be a full-time job held for over a year and be directly the result of our investment. So no multipliers, no supply chain jobs get counted. I should have a pipeline of just over 1,000 jobs by now, but despite the disruption of the pandemic, it's 4,586. That's 13 years progress in 3 years. And that doesn't include the 3,000 jobs in the pipeline with British Volt's Gigafactory and 5,000 more in the supply chain for that we're trying to land. For every pound I spend, £3 is returned to Treasury in payroll taxes alone. Not counting VAT, not duty, not corporation tax, not multipliers, just the payroll taxes. But despite creating all these extra jobs, I get no more budget. I get no more money to boost school outcomes, no more money to tackle health inequalities, no more money to train people for the jobs we've created. Now, I can lever in all the money we need to fix these problems. Like I said, there's trillions in undeployed capital. I've spoken to asset managers and banks and pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, and they all want to work with us. But I need an income stream to repay them. Obesity will cost the North East 1.65 billion a year by 2050, according to Public Health England. Our public transport budget is less than a tenth of that. If I could invest in a joined-up system of public transport, cycling and walking, we could have a system faster and cheaper than driving for hundreds of thousands of people in the urban core of my region. It would save the NHS a fortune, and it would address a lot of the climate change problems. Every pound invested in retrofit saves the NHS 42p in chronic health conditions associated with poor housing. There's a raft of figures I could give you. But in the North East, we have the country's best hospitals, yet we have the worst health. We seem content to let people's lives collapse into stress and despair. Then we fund the drugs and the surgery and the criminal justice system, instead of investing upstream in youth services and housing and transport. I can reduce the friction, but unless I have the motive force, the money, I can't do much else. I've written a paper for the RSA called Regional Wealth Generation. If you just Google Jamie Driscoll Regional Wealth Generation, you'll find it. It makes the case for fiscal innovations. Not tax raising powers, by the way. The North East has a business tax rate, a business rate base in taxes of £300 per head. In London, it's £940 per head. Raising local taxes to fix our problems is a vicious circle. Newcastle, 25% of households get some kind of council tax support already. If we have to tax our people to fund our own, it's not going to work, is it? So how about we implement an earn-back scheme? So when I create a job, Treasury, let me keep the first 18 months of payroll taxes. Remember, by definition, these are direct jobs that only happened because we invested. And not a hypothetical tax take. Give me back the actual figure raised based on the actual real jobs created. We have that information. You have inbuilt perfect accountability. Payments follow results. You can tweak the duration based on the deprivation, so perhaps I would get 18 months worth, you might get 12 months worth in an area with low deprivation, a high tax base. Here's another one. How about they give mayors the flexibility of a land assembly inside a mayoral development corporation? A mayoral development corporation is a line on a map in which you change the planning powers. Now, planning reform is a political minefield, but a mayoral development corporation can only exist with the approval of the local authority and the mayoral combined authority. They are specifically in regeneration areas. They allow for fast-track compulsory purchase powers. Well, they don't, but we need to allow for fast-track compulsory purchase powers, which are already by definition at a fair market price. And if a landowner objects, let the Secretary of State adjudicate. You have a democratic triple lock. Local authority, mayor, Secretary of State all have to agree. We could unlock so many bomb sites. And all of the planning stalls about building things spoiling views from villages in the southeast of England, that's a problem someone else can fix. I want to be able to regenerate these areas. How about a regional wealth fund where I can borrow at close to base rate to provide patient equity in scale-ups and start-ups to boost economic activity? We're doing this anyway, actually, with the North Tyne, with our Green New Deal fund and our Access to Finance fund. But I want to scale it up. A £500 million fund would create 14,000 additional jobs and de-risk private sector investment. And we pay the money back to Treasury anyway. And how about we finally start investing in prevention with Investor Save? Let's create a principle where mayors can pitch to government that if they achieve a social good, they get the savings from the health, criminal justice or environmental good that comes with it. Let's establish a principle of flexibility. So we could co-produce the evidence criteria and agree a rate of return with central government. But if I can get 100,000 people to give up owning their cars and walking, cycling and using public transport instead, then how about I get the financial rewards of the better health that we know will follow? That enables me to lever in the finance because then I have the future income to repay it. And while we're on, let's get lower friction between NE1 and SW1 with a levelling up board. So it doesn't depend on me having a minister in place long enough to build a relationship. Let's get a director in each domestic department on it, chaired by the mayor and with ministerial sponsorship and attendance. So next time central government have a plan for investment in any service, they talk to us and we tailor it to take advantage of what's on the ground and what we're already doing. Duplication and delay costs us a fortune. So this talk is titled The Politics of Levelling Up, Aligning Interests Across Levels of Government and Political Traditions. And my argument is that that alignment can only last if it delivers. That requires a paradigm shift. Off the T and onto the green, out of SW1 and into the regions. It's got very little to do with left or right. It's about opening up more space for innovation in governance. It's about deploying more capital for socially sustainable outcomes. It's about reducing the burden on public services by increasing incomes and improving health and education. And whichever government does this, finally cracks it, will reap the rewards of actually making progress on these previously intractable problems. The only way to reduce the friction that's kept these left behind communities stuck fast for decades. It's a shift in paradigm and it needs the fiscal tools to go with it that I was talking about. The moral case to improve people's lives is undeniable, but so is the economic argument. Unfulfilled human potential costs us all. I was asked by a journalist what powers I wanted in the North East, and I said I don't think of it in those terms. I think about what powers I don't want short of independence. I don't want an army or a foreign policy. I don't want different murder laws or abortion laws in different parts of the country like you get in the US. I don't want different income taxes that just lead to displacement. But I want a say in everything else. So not so much a coup d'etat as a coup de north. I don't want to keep approaching ministers like Oliver Twist saying, please sir, can I have some more? I don't want to keep asking for fish. I want a fishing rod. Thank you.
Oscar. So we got at least 20 minutes, 25 minutes for comments and questions, either from our select audience here or the rather larger one online. But I mean, let me kick off with a few questions to you directly, Jamie. I mean, you're sort of, in a way, you're pushing on an open door. I mean, everybody from sort of Michael Gove to, you know, all the way down the chain seems to sort of get this argument now. I mean, why? Why is it not happening faster? And what would you sort of envisage as the next steps?
Yeah. So if everybody sees it's a good idea, why hasn't it happened already?
And kind of what's resisting it?
Yeah. A large part of it is not everybody does get it, I think. I think people would like to see the outcomes, but they're not willing. All of us would like to be slim and have a fit body. We're not prepared to do the exercise. And that requires, to be honest, getting it off the tee and onto the green. So it was the Community Renewal Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, any number of these things. It's going to require saying, there you go, mayors, crack on with it. And that's very difficult for Westminster MPs to do. It's notable when you talk to Andy Burnham, for example. He says his complete mindset about government has changed since he became a mayor. And we'll say that the difficulty they had in the last Labour government with fixing various problems in the northwest and trying to do it from Whitehall, he said it didn't work very well. So it really is. You know what would be the best thing to do? Would be to make ministers shadow a mayor for a week. And I think if you did that and they saw it with their own eyes what you're doing and the difference, it works. So this is not an endorsement for any one particular candidate in the Conservative Party. So with Nadeem, we've worked very well through the vaccine rollout and through the education. Since he's taken over in education, I've been negotiating the devolved deal, my officials have. When it stalls with the DfE officials and my officials, I talk to Nadeem and I say, look, this is the policy objective. Do you agree with it? He says, yeah, I do quite like that. Your officials have reached deadlock with mine. Can you tell them to be flexible? So, yeah, I might not agree with what you're saying, but I will tell them to negotiate on it. That unblocks things. That's a levelling up board. So we've got the plan for levelling up directors, but that's one civil servant. And I think the cities and local growth units are going. I'm not 100% sure on that. But they're not the decision makers.
One of the things I've heard you complaining about a lot, and not just you, you didn't mention it particularly in your speech, is you really don't like having to bid for money. Why not? It's a sort of test of the competence of an administration, the quality of its bid, isn't it?
No, unfortunately. If it were, it would be sound. It's a bit. The mindset is, right, I want my bathroom retiling, I'll invite 3 tilers round and I'll choose the best one. Unfortunately, it does not scale. Because if we look at some of the examples we're talking about, the Community Renewal Fund, you're invited to bid, deadline's June the 10th last year. You're told you're going to find out in July. You don't find out till October. And then the funding is stop-start. There's cliff edges built in. We saw the same thing with the Transforming Cities Fund. And it also means that, by the way, that people have got to spend a vast amount of time and energy to put these bids in. And it also means people put bids in anyway, even if that wouldn't have been their priority. So the bids chase the funding pots. It destroys strategic growth and development in a place. It shouldn't be bidding, it should be, there's the money. And if they want to say, and by the way, you're going to have to give us a credible plan before you have it, that will be fine. But if we want to fix this, we know it costs money, allocate the money, make a decision on a national basis. That's what national government's for. We are willing to raise taxes, we're not willing to raise taxes, whatever. You can have 500 million, you can have 3 billion. But that's your budget. Now you tell us how you're going to spend it, but you decide. So central government set the priorities for levelling up, but you absolutely must let the people deliver it in their own way.
But those of you who are watching online, do raise your hands in the usual way if you want to ask a question or make a comment. I mean, just more specifically on, as it were, the kind of politics of levelling up. I mean, do you think, like I said earlier, I mean, there was a fair amount of impetus behind the levelling up policy when we had the white paper. I mean, it was seen as a symbol of, something that governments of the last 30 or 40 years sort of should have done, and it was also, of course, a symbol of the new demographics of the Tory coalition, the post-Brexit Tory coalition, with a much bigger lower income voter base in the Midlands and the North. I mean, do you feel that, notwithstanding current events, that it's kind of run out of steam a bit? We haven't heard so much about it. I mean, there was going to be, the things were in the pipeline, like the appointment of levelling up directors and so on. I mean, has some of the impetus gone? What's your feeling of?
Yeah. So speculate. I've had lots of conversations. But obviously, you keep private conversations private, otherwise nobody talks to you ever again. But my sense is that this was never fully accepted by everyone in government. So if we look at what successive budgets have done, the amounts allocated to levelling up, to mayoral combined authorities, it was one of the things that I understand the reason the levelling up paper was delayed is because there was an attempt to get a budget to go with it, and no budget came with it. So if the Treasury or individuals within the Treasury who have the power over these decisions don't want to fund it, it doesn't matter. You can have a great policy, but if there's no money to carry it out, it's not going to happen.
I mean, one of the things that you and me have talked about separately is the whole business of the kind of rekindling of manufacturing, which is a sort of sub-theme in levelling up, particularly in former manufacturing areas. And the pandemic also raised the whole issue of the supply chain problem and our over-dependence on these extended supply chains. So that there has been a kind of a desire. Well, we're never going to go back to kind of manufacturing levels of 50 years ago, but that we should think about rekindling manufacturing where we can. And there is a very big potential industry based in the northeast, Teesside and Tyneside potentially, which is the wind turbine industry. We have a principle of 60% local content for these wind farms, and you have said to me that you're pretty sure that a lot of these contracts are being gamed, and that what should be 60% local content, we should have a wind turbine industry. But actually, a lot of the wind turbines are being built in Europe or the Middle East or China. I mean, over to you. I mean, what?
No, yeah, you're absolutely right, David. Yeah.
Well, what's the evidence for that, and what does Michael Gove know about this?
So, well, I've certainly spoken to Kwasi about it, and Bayes ministers as well, and the headline is that you have to have 60% local content, but that includes maintenance and deployment, and then some of it goes to a tier 1 contractor, but they don't check who the tier 2 and tier 3 contractors are, and the amount that actually comes back is minimal. And so one of the I talk to a lot of the businesses in my area who are successful in this, but they're employing hundreds rather than thousands because of the amount of work that we're not getting. And there was one example of Seagreen, a wind farm off Scotland, where £250 million worth of work went to the Gulf, £500 million went to China, and in the end, the developers, obviously they're looking at the numbers, because it was £1 million cheaper by the time they'd done it and shipped it all the way across the globe and installed it. So for that little bit extra money, it could have come here. Now, I'm not even saying that we should subsidise it. I'm just saying we should enforce the local content. And if it doesn't even break any trade agreements, because if you do it on the basis of an economic impact assessment, obviously the payroll taxes are going to more than justify it. And that's where we're not getting to. And I've been in the room a couple of times where the Prime Minister's given his speeches talking about the green industrial revolution. He says governments have billions, but the private sector have trillions. But the most important thing is consumer choice. Well, regardless of the validity of that argument, that sounds like an abnegation of doing anything about it. If you're saying we're going to let the market carry on, you are accepting where we are. So you can either have levelling up and do something about it, or you can say, no, we'll leave the market to it and take it or leave it on levelling up. You can't do both.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to be the Saudi Arabia of wind power, I mean, we need to have a proper domestic. Have you spoken to Ben Houchin about it?
They've got a different approach. So they I think it's actually stalled a big wind turbine manufacturer in there. So we've got a cables manufacturer. We've obviously got the Gigafactory on with electric batteries. I've spoken to the BEIS ministers in particular because we do have the catapult that does the R&D on these things. They're so big now, these wind turbines, they don't fit in it anymore. So we need a bigger one because these things are huge. They're like 102 metres long, and you bend them and flex them, sensors all over the place to get the information off them. And if you imagine what happens if one of those things breaks, it's pretty scary. So it's a very expensive building that's needed that runs into the tens of millions. And we have one, and it has anchored a lot of work here. But the wind turbines are getting bigger, and we're not building a bigger one at the moment, but the Germans are going to build one. And so all the wind turbine manufacturers are going to test their stuff there and land up building it there, or certainly the high value jobs around R&D will be there. We need it here. And I've spoken to ministers who have accepted this argument, but it's friction that's happening. Nobody said no, it just hasn't happened yet.
Well, let's hope it does. Any comments from here? Connor.
Thanks. Really, really fascinating talk, Jamie. Mr. Driscoll.
Say who you are, by the
Oh,
way.
sorry, Conor MacDonald, Head of Economic Policy here. I'm really interested in your thoughts around fiscal devolution. Why wouldn't a system that had pretty strong equalization mechanisms work? And if you didn't have some form of fiscal devolution over rates of whatever taxes you could agree with government, are you always sort of in a system where you have to justify yourself to central government? Even with an earning back scheme, you still have to you will have agreed a set of metrics with central government. And isn't sort of the whole point of devolution that you avoid having sort of these sorts of prescriptive mechanisms in place and that you can actually have the autonomy?
No, you're absolutely right, Conor. It's a question of sequencing there. If I went... actually, I was going to say to Rishi Sunak, if I went to Nadeem Zahawi for now and said, Nadeem, I've got a brilliant plan. They are 3.5 billion quid. Can you sign me a cheque, please? He's not going to say yes. We're locked into CSR spending rounds. And what I want to be independent of those things because it reduces the friction. And so looking at this in the early months of the pandemic, I was thinking, what are the problems we've got in the North East? There's two. One is that a lot of people feel they have to leave to pursue their careers. Two, there's just not enough investment, public, private, whatever. There's just not enough money coming in. And yes, it has to be invested wisely. Everybody would accept that. And so it's how do we break that? And a conversation with a Treasury Minister talking about fiscal devolution. So we talked about it in the M10, and I'm the one who does a lot of the thinking on it and a lot of the driving of it. And ended up talking to one of the ministers and said to her, what's the problem? Why don't we do this? He says, well, we don't trust you. It's not we don't trust you, Jamie. We don't trust anyone. We're the Treasury. That's how it works. And I said, well, how about a system, went away and thought about it, had another meeting, how about a system where you don't have to trust me, where you only give me the money if I can show the saving? Now, the problem is that the savings and the investment can be separated by decades in time and by complex mechanisms. Now, everybody knows that if people keep themselves fit and healthy, it saves a fortune on healthcare. But how do you prove that? Yeah. Well, you can't. But in Manchester, I had a conversation on Turbine about this, where they have the police and crime budget devolved and the health budget devolved, is get everybody a bed every night, so there's no street homelessness, costs £11,000 per person per year. it saves £24,000 in A&E and people being locked up in the cells for drunk and disorderly and so on. And so that's the basic principle of it. So it's finding these mechanisms to do it. And I was wanting to start out with fairly simple things, but there are other things published by other think tanks that are saying, well, how about we hypothecate an element of income tax? I said, yeah, great. And if you can get me that, I'll be very happy. But this is aligning the political will. And let's start for something where there is no logical objection to it. There might be people saying, I don't want to leave go, but it's actually, there is no logical objection to any of the things I'm proposing. And for the first and only time in my life, in a meeting with Treasury officials, I saw them getting excited and saying, this is a really compelling argument.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. By the way, on the health and longevity, we had Raggy Valley, who was speaking in one of our earlier Levelling Up lectures here, and he was somewhat sceptical about the kind of Michael Marmot perspective, or at least the sort of socioeconomic determinism that Marmot sometimes sounds that he slips into. And he was actually showing that some of the very poorest groups in Britain, people of Bangladeshi and Pakistani background, actually have healthier outcomes, suffer less of the major 6 or 7 diseases, have longer lifespans and so on, because obviously, you know, human agency is important too. And sometimes with Marmot you get the kind of, if your income is such and such, your health outcome is going to be such and such. And actually, it does matter what you eat. It does matter how you exercise. It does matter how much alcohol you consume. But anyway, there was another gentleman here. Just say who you are.
Thank you. Ashton Cull, formerly of Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority, so I can accord with everything Jamie said about the difficulties of dealing with government not necessarily being political, because a lot of what you were saying we also had issues with when I was at the Combined Authority myself. But I want to ask the question with regards to Scotland and Wales, and in a way Northern Ireland as well. More devolution, but in several measures not as successful as England in those areas. How do we account for that?
In terms of Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, obviously got very different effects there. A lot of people in Scotland tell me although it's devolved to Scotland, it's not actually devolved out beyond the Scottish Parliament, that it's actually really quite centralised. And I'm not an expert on it, but I would predict that they haven't solved the problem of friction. In Wales, you are actually seeing a lot of interesting things happening in recent years, and a very radical approach to community wealth generation and divesting power out of the Senate and into local communities. So it's early days, but that's where I would start to look for the answers. And it's interesting actually on your question. I was having this conversation with Michael Marmot a couple of weeks ago, and he says, yeah, of course we've got to do smoking and healthy eating and all that stuff. So he almost parks that and moves on. And what you were talking about there, Dave, was absolutely right. He was talking about agency. And I was talking to him saying, look, it doesn't matter whether we measure how much people are paid or their educational background or their health. They're basically just different facets of the same thing. And it is the case that for a very large number of people, that I'm not in control of my life is the problem.
But it shouldn't just be seen as it were, a kind of conservative argument that people have agency and responsibility for themselves up to a point.
It's funny, isn't it? I mean, there's lots of traditions in the labour movement. One of them is the cooperative tradition. And the cooperative tradition is about self-empowerment, is about wealth generation.
It's interesting what you were saying about, I mean, I think some of the things you were talking about, the trends are clearly moving in your direction. I mean, just on the devolution argument in general, but also on social mobility. I mean, the Social Mobility Commission now is very much trying to move beyond that kind of save the bright ones kind of approach, which arguably we've sort of had hitherto of, that stress on the kind of long mobility of, people at the bottom of the pile getting to Oxbridge. Obviously that's a good thing, but it's only ever going to involve quite a small number of people, and they're looking much more at how, the incremental steps for the vast majority of people who are kind of somewhere in the middle is actually what social mobility should be about. But anyway, we do have a couple more questions here. Just say who you are and where you're from if it's relevant.
Hello, I'm Sophia Greenblatt. I am from College Green Group. We run the APPG for regeneration development and also the APPG for housing market and housing delivery. And you mentioned planning, which is a massive issue that members of our advisory board have mentioned time and time again. However, it's often, a focus on the southeast and southwest, where sort of these issues are really people being upset about homes being built in areas, as you mentioned, where it's sort of a building beautiful situation. But from what I'm hearing, in the north, it's often a lot more about regeneration, and there's a lot more focus on regenerating areas that need housing, but where there's existing stock that basically needs to be refurbished, rebuilt, etc. So could you comment a little bit about what you see as the vision for regeneration in the north?
Yeah, that's a very good question too. So if you look at the Brownfield Housing Fund, which we've had devolved, got 24 million and an extra slug of 8 million. In many cases, we had spades in the ground within months. In other cases, it's extremely difficult, and it's often land assembly that's the difficulty. So not planning, it's how is anyone going to put money into this and make a profit? And the thresholds on these profits are often inordinately high. So one of the things that I insist on in our Brownfield Housing Fund, we'll have a clawback if they make more than 10%. Because if the state is subsidising it, they shouldn't be making large profits because they didn't need the state subsidy. So you then have places where you've got old lead works and there's tunnels, and most of Newcastle has tunnels underneath it because people have been ripping coal out of the ground for hundreds and hundreds of years. There's the apocryphal story that every time somebody moves house, the solicitor says, oh yeah, someone's auntie, went down to use the netty one night and then the backyard collapsed and went in the coal mine. And then you've also had this problem of lots of land parcels. If we could throw a line around these places, we could invest in them. Rather than at the moment, what happens is something only really gets built if you can get a very high return. And it's a little parcel, you end up with a high value tower block next to a bomb site. Then a few years later, another high value tower block comes up. Nobody is building the affordable housing, nobody's place making. The schools, they do the very minimum, they'll argue about the 106 contribution. It's just not working. If I could just draw a big line on a map, and a lot of the people in my area agree with me, it's not just my idea, and say, right, our local authority agrees with me, we are going to say these people have to sell us the land, fair market price, and they, rather than going through long legal disputes, say, sorry, Secretary of State, yes or no? No, fine. Yes, great. It's bought. Nobody's losing out. We can then get on and build these places. Now, at the moment, that's largely being held up because of the people looking out of their villages saying, but I don't want any planning changes. Well, it's up to them. I'm not mayor for their areas. But in my areas, I want to be able to fix these things. And talking to developers, by the way, they love the idea.
Of course they do. They get to build things, make some money.
Lady on the left.
Hi, my name is Gadisha. I am Public Affairs Officer at Cancer Research UK. So, smoking is one of the biggest causes of preventable death in the UK. And there are also substantial inequalities in smoking rates across the country, with higher rates of smoking in the more deprived areas. The recently launched Javed Khan review on tobacco control outlines the roadmap for the government to address these issues. My question is, what role do you think Metro mayors have to support the implementation of these measures and pave the way towards a smoke-free UK, particularly if the government is unwilling to do so?
Thank you.
Yeah, how do Metro mayors do something when government doesn't want to do it? I'm afraid I don't have an answer for that question. So the only way you persuade government to do it is to make it in their interests. Now, that is, if you like, the whole point behind Invest to Save, is the mechanisms are complex. When you talk about dealing with obesity or heart attacks or any of the things that you're talking about in terms of specific diseases, well, exercise we know makes a massive difference, as does diet, as does agency, as does not smoking. As does, by the way, having a job, but only for a day and a half a week. Beyond that, actually, there's no particular health benefits. But not working, when you're of working age and you feel left out, is bad for you. So, with the powers to get funding, if we just got the diseases down and they didn't care how we did it, then that would give us the tools. It's about the flexibility on it. So there are things that I'm sure when we talk about tobacco, I haven't read that report, I don't know, but there will be things to do with advertising, there will be things to do with tax and things like that, which should we devolve those things? Well, that's an interesting question. Should metro mayors have the power to legislate? Now, not directly, I would suggest, but metro mayors, I think, should have the powers to propose legislation, and those things that would normally come under secondary legislation, it should be the case that metro mayors can propose it, and the Secretary of State can sponsor it, and then it just lies as an order on Parliament. So that would be the way we could perhaps do some of these things. Flexibility, you would see more happening because you'd have the bandwidth, but you'd have to align it with the financial rewards for achieving success.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think we should probably stop before we're the only people in the room. But
I have been expecting my phone to start buzzing, saying he's gone, he's gone.
Anyway, well, that was very interesting, and you are clearly a very reasonable person for someone who, according to Wikipedia, has been inspired by Noam Chomsky and Paul Mason. Anyway, well, all we can really do is hope that whatever happens at the top of the Conservative Party, that levelling up goes back to the kind of central domestic policy initiative, which I think it should be for this government and indeed any future government. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much,
Really
David.
good talk.
Yeah, nice to be here.